You see a lot of things under the Arizona sun. Things that bake the good right out of a man and leave something hard and twisted behind. But on that summer day in 1882, in a dusty little settlement called Fort Buchanan, a rancher named William Garrison was about to see something that would change him and this whole territory forever. It started with a crowd. Crowds are never a good sign out on the frontier. They either mean a hanging or something that leads to one. Will pulled his wagon to a halt, the dust settling around him like a shroud. He was a man carved from the land itself, 42 years old with eyes that had seen too much and hands that had worked too hard. His ranch, the Double G, was his whole world, but he was about to find out his world was a lot smaller and a lot uglier than he'd ever imagined. Through the gaps in the crowd, he saw it. A boy, an Apache boy, no older than 12, tied to a hitching post like an animal. His hands were bound tight, his face a mask of dirt and defiance. And standing over him, with a big leather whip in his hand, was a man named Curtis Blackwood. Blackwood was a cattle baron with a soul as barren as the land he claimed to own. He was the kind of man who thought justice was something you could braid out of leather and lay across another man's back. "This little savage," Blackwood boomed, his voice slick with self-righteous anger, "was caught stealing from my herd. It's time he learned what we do to thieves." The crowd muttered, some in agreement, some just thirsty for a spectacle. But Will, he wasn't listening to them. He was listening to the boy. The boy looked right past Blackwood, right through the jeering faces, and his eyes locked onto Will's. And in a voice clear as a desert spring, a voice that cut through all the noise, he said something strange. Something that didn't make any sense. He didn't beg for his life. He didn't plead for mercy. He looked at Will Garrison, a total stranger, and asked a question that hung in the scorching air like a prophecy. "Sir," the boy said, his English perfect, "can you put down their whips forever?" And in that moment, Will Garrison knew this wasn't about a few stolen cattle. This was about something else entirely. Something that had been festering in the dark for a long, long time. Will's boots hit the ground with a thud that seemed to silence the whole town. He moved through the crowd not like a man pushing people aside, but like a river cutting through soft earth. He just appeared, right in front of Blackwood. "Let him go, Curtis," Will said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the weight of iron. Blackwood sneered, his face a mess of scars and sunburn. "Garrison, should have known you'd stick your nose in where it don't belong. This is my business." "Beating a child in the town square makes it everyone's business," Will replied, his hand resting near the Colt on his hip. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. "You say he stole from you. Where's your proof?" "Proof?" Blackwood spat. "3 of my best cattle gone, tracks leading straight from my pasture toward Apache land, and this little rat was seen near my fence line. That's all the proof I need." Will looked from Blackwood's twisted face to the boy. There was no fear in the boy's eyes, just a strange and patient fire. "What's your name, son?" Will asked him. "Running Fox," the boy said. "I took no cattle. I was searching for healing plants. For my grandmother. She is sick." "A likely story," Blackwood growled, raising the whip again. But something about the way the boy said it, the way he stood there, proud and unbroken, it rang true. Will had spent his life reading 2 things, the land and the men who walked on it. And this boy wasn't lying, which meant Blackwood was. But the question was, why? Why go to all this trouble for a few head of cattle? It didn't add up. "I'll tell you what," Will said, his voice deceptively calm. "I'll pay you for the cattle. Double their worth. Just cut the boy loose." The crowd murmured. That was a serious offer. But Blackwood just shook his head, a sick smile on his lips. "This ain't about money, Garrison. It's about sending a message." And that's when Will understood. This whole scene, this public spectacle, it wasn't justice. It was a performance, a carefully staged play for the benefit of the town. But why? What was the real message Blackwood was trying to send? Will looked at the boy, tied to the post, and then back at the cattle baron, and a cold dread began to creep up his spine. This wasn't the end of a cattle theft. This was the beginning of something much, much worse. "Let the boy go," a firm voice cut through the tension. It was Margaret Sullivan, the owner of the trading post, a woman whose word carried almost as much weight as Will's. "If Will Garrison says he'll look into it, that's good enough for me. Cut him loose, Curtis." Shakari. Blackwood, seeing the crowd's mood shift, threw the whip down with a curse. "This isn't over, Garrison," he snarled as he untied the boy's ropes. Will helped Running Fox to his feet, noticing the raw red burns on his wrists. "I'll ride with you," Will said to the boy. "Show me where your people are. Then I'm going to find out what really happened to those cattle." As they rode out of town, leaving the simmering anger of Fort Buchanan behind, Will couldn't shake the boy's question. "Can you put down their whips forever?" It was more than a plea. It was a challenge. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized it wasn't just about Blackwood's whip. It was about the invisible whips of fear and hatred that drove men to do terrible things. They rode for hours into the canyons that the Apache called home. The land here was different, wiser. It held secrets. Running Fox was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke. "The plants I seek," he said, "they are for my grandmother's cough. The white man's doctor says there is no cure, but my grandmother knows the old ways." Will nodded. He'd lost his own wife to a fever the doctors couldn't name. He knew the limits of their medicine. They finally reached a hidden encampment, a place of such quiet beauty it made the ugliness of the town seem a world away. An old woman with eyes like ancient stones came forward. Swift Creek woman, Running Fox's grandmother. She thanked Will with a quiet dignity that put men like Blackwood to shame. Will promised her he would find the truth. And as he rode away the next morning, he felt like he was on the edge of a great discovery. He thought he was just investigating a simple crime. He had no idea he was about to unravel a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the territory, a conspiracy of greed so dark it threatened to swallow them all. He had promised to find 3 missing cattle. What he found instead was a grave. It wasn't a human grave. It was a watering hole, a small secluded one that Will knew the Apache used. And lying by its edge were 6 dead coyotes, their bodies contorted. There were no bullet holes, no signs of a fight. They had just dropped. Will knelt down, his heart pounding a slow, heavy drum. He dipped a finger in the water, brought it to his nose. The smell was faint, almost unnoticeable, but he recognized it. Arsenic. The water was poisoned. This changed everything. This wasn't about scaring people anymore. This was about erasing them. He and Running Fox, who had insisted on coming with him, followed the cattle tracks. Just as the boy had said, they didn't lead deeper into Apache land. They led east, back toward the settled territories. They led straight to a small, run-down ranch owned by a man named Henry Carmichael, one of Blackwood's cronies. And there, grazing peacefully in a hidden pasture, were the 3 missing cattle, their brands clear as day in the morning sun. It was a setup, a perfect, vicious setup. Stage a theft, blame the Apache, whip a boy in the town square to stir up hatred. But for what? The poisoned waterhole was the answer. It was the next step in the plan. When the Apache started getting sick, maybe dying, Blackwood could claim it was a curse, or that they'd poisoned the water themselves in some ritual. The settlers, already riled up, would demand action. The army would be called in, and the Apache would be driven off their land for good. This wasn't just about Curtis Blackwood's greed. The scale of it, the sheer evil of it, was too big for one man. He had partners. "We have to go back," Will said, his voice grim. "We have to warn your people." But as they turned to leave, a sound echoed off the canyon walls. The sound of hoofbeats. 3 riders, silhouetted against the sky. And in the middle, sitting tall in his saddle, was Curtis Blackwood. He wasn't alone, and he wasn't smiling. "Looking for something, Garrison?" Blackwood called out, his voice dripping with menace. He'd followed them. Or, Will realized with a sickening lurch, he'd been waiting for them all along. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was an ambush. And that's when Will noticed what Blackwood was holding. It wasn't the whip. It was a rifle. And it was pointed straight at Running Fox. "I found your cattle, Blackwood," Will said. moving so he was standing between the rifle and the boy. His own hand was a whisper away from his Colt. "Did you now?" Blackwood said, his eyes cold and flat as a snake's. "Funny. I don't see any Apache raiders. Just you, trespassing, with a cattle thief." "The boy didn't steal anything, and you know it," Will shot back. "This was a setup. You moved the cattle here yourself." Blackwood actually chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "You're a clever man, Garrison. Too clever for your own good. You should have stayed on your ranch. Now, you've seen too much." One of Blackwood's men shifted in his saddle, his hand inching toward his gun. Will knew he was outmatched, 3-1, but he couldn't back down. Not now. It was Running Fox who spoke, his voice steady. "You poisoned the water where our women and children drink. This is not the way of a warrior. It is the way of a coward." Blackwood's face darkened with rage. "You keep your mouth shut, you little heathen," he roared, and that's when his composure cracked. The mask of the righteous cattleman fell away, and Will saw the monster underneath. "Why, Blackwood?" Will demanded. "Why all this? It can't just be about grazing rights." Blackwood's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "This land has more than grass on it, Garrison. It has a secret, something worth more than all the cattle in Arizona. And I'm not going to let a bunch of savages or some self-righteous rancher get in my way." A secret in the land? Before Will could process what that meant, one of Blackwood's men made his move. He drew his pistol, fast as lightning. But Will was faster. His Colt was in his hand, a blur of motion. A single shot echoed through the canyon. The henchman cried out, clutching his shoulder, his gun tumbling into the dust. Will didn't hesitate. He swung his aim to the second man, whose eyes went wide with shock. "Drop it!" Will yelled. "Both of you!" But Blackwood wasn't rattled. He was still smiling that ugly smile. "You're good, Garrison, I'll give you that. But you're still just one man." He raised his rifle. Time seemed to slow down. Will knew he couldn't get a shot off before Blackwood fired. He was a dead man. Running Fox was a dead man. And then a fourth voice cut through the air. "Put the rifle down, Curtis." Will's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It was Margaret Sullivan, the trading post owner. She stepped out from behind a rock formation, a shotgun held steady in her hands. For a second, Will felt a surge of relief. Help had arrived. But then he saw where the shotgun was pointed. It wasn't pointed at Blackwood. It was pointed straight at him. The betrayal hit Will like a physical blow. Margaret, the one who'd stood up for him in town, the one who'd seemed like an ally. It had all been an act. "Margaret? Why?" Will asked, his voice hoarse. "Business, Will. It's always business," she said, her face unreadable. "Curtis is a brute, but his ambition is useful. We have a partnership." Blackwood lowered his rifle, laughing. "You see, Garrison, you're not the only one who can play chess. You thought you were uncovering a little crime, but you stumbled into the game of kings. The secret in the land. It had to be what she was after. She was the brains. Blackwood was the muscle. It all made a sickening kind of sense. She'd backed Will in town to see what he knew, to gauge the threat he posed. She'd played him perfectly. "So you're in on it all?" Will said, his mind racing. "The stolen cattle, the poisoned water. You'd kill innocent people for money?" "It's not murder, Will. It's progress," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "The railroad is coming through, and the survey maps show a vein of silver running right through that canyon where the Apache have their camp. A vein big enough to make us richer than Midas. We just need to clear the land. And you, my friend, have become an obstacle." This was the truth, ugly and rotten to the core, a conspiracy of greed that went all the way to the top. But even as the trap closed around him, Will noticed something small. While Margaret and Blackwood were gloating, Running Fox had been slowly, imperceptibly, backing away. He was inching toward a narrow crevice in the canyon wall, a space too small for a man, but just right for a boy. Will knew what he had to do. He had to create a diversion. "You won't get away with this," Will said, taking a step toward Blackwood, drawing their attention. "People know I came out here. They know I was with the boy. When we don't come back, they'll come looking. Margaret just smiled. And what will they find? The bodies of a rancher and an Apache boy killed in a skirmish. A tragic misunderstanding. Curtis will be a hero for defending his property. I, the grieving friend, will ensure the story is told correctly. It's all taken care of. She was right. The plan was flawless. They had thought of everything. Or so they thought. Will locked eyes with Running Fox. He gave the slightest, almost invisible nod. Go. And then Will did something insane. He dropped his gun. He just let it fall into the dust. Blackwood and Margaret stared, confused. For a split second they were distracted. And in that second, Running Fox darted into the crevice and disappeared. Blackwood roared in frustration and fired his rifle at the rocks where the boy had vanished. But it was too late. He was gone. No matter, Margaret said, recovering quickly. She leveled her shotgun at Will's chest. We still have you, and without you, there's no one left to tell the tale. Will stood there unarmed, facing down two killers and a shotgun. He had saved the boy, but he had just signed his own death warrant. He closed his eyes, thinking of his late wife, of the ranch he'd built with his own two hands. But the blast of the shotgun never came. Instead, he heard a gasp, and then a thud. Will opened his eyes. Margaret Sullivan was on the ground, a feathered arrow sticking out of her shoulder, and standing on the ridge above them, silhouetted against the blue sky, were 20 Apache warriors, bows drawn, their arrows aimed at Blackwood and his remaining man. Running Fox had not run for his life. He had run for help, and he had brought the thunder. The tables had turned so fast it was like the world had flipped upside down. Blackwood and his last man stood frozen, their faces pale with terror. The Apache warriors were silent, deadly specters on the rocks above. In the center of them stood Swift Creek Woman, her face a mask of cold fury. Will didn't waste a second. He dove for his Colt, scooping it out of the dust. By the time he was on his feet, Blackwood's man had thrown his gun down and had his hands in the air. But Blackwood was different. He was trapped, cornered, but the fury in his eyes was stronger than his fear. You think this is over? He screamed, his voice cracking. He grabbed the wounded Margaret Sullivan and pulled her up, using her as a human shield. He pressed his pistol to her head. Tell them to back off, or she dies. Margaret cried out in pain and fear. The woman who had been so calm and calculating just moments before was now a trembling, bleeding mess. Will saw the warriors on the ridge hesitate. They would not risk harming a woman, even an enemy. Blackwood had one last card to play, and it was a nasty one. He's bluffing, Will said, trying to keep his voice steady. He needs her. She's the one with the railroad connections. Try me, Garrison, Blackwood yelled, his eyes wild. I've got nothing to lose. And that's when Will remembered something. The secret of the land. The silver. Blackwood had said it was on Apache land, but Running Fox had said he was looking for healing plants for his grandmother. What if they were connected? Running Fox, Will called out. The plants your grandmother needs. Where do they grow? The boy, standing beside his grandmother on the ridge, pointed. He pointed to a small cave set high in the canyon wall, not far from where they were standing. There, he said, they grow only in the shade of the moon cave. Blackwood's eyes flickered toward the cave, just for a second, but it was enough. Will saw a flash of pure, naked greed in his eyes. That was it. The silver wasn't just on the land. It was in that cave. The healing plants were the marker. Will now understood the depth of Blackwood's obsession. But more than that, he saw a path. A desperate, dangerous path. Let her go, Blackwood, Will said, his voice dropping low. Let her go, and you can have the silver. Margaret's eyes widened. The Apache warriors murmured amongst themselves. Swift Creek Woman stared down at Will, her expression unreadable. Blackwood hesitated, his mind clearly turning. What are you talking about? You heard me, Will said, taking a slow step forward. I don't care about the silver. These people, he gestured to the Apache, they care about their home, their sacred places, not the rocks inside them. Let Margaret go, and I'll convince them to let you walk away with whatever you can carry from that cave. It was a crazy gamble, a lie built on a guess, but it was the only play he had. Blackwood stared at Will, then at the cave, then at the bleeding woman in his arms. Will could see the war inside him, the greed fighting the desperation. "How do I know I can trust you?" Blackwood growled. "You don't," Will said. "But right now, I'm the only chance you've got." Slowly, agonizingly, Blackwood shoved Margaret away from him. She collapsed to the ground, sobbing. He kept his pistol trained on Will, his eyes still fixed on the entrance to that cave. "All right, Garrison," Blackwood said, a feverish light in his eyes. "Show me the silver." Will holstered his gun. He turned to the ridge and looked up at Swift Creek Woman. He was hoping she understood the desperate game he was playing. He was hoping she trusted him. Her face gave away nothing. She simply nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. The warriors lowered their bows. Will started walking toward the cave, Blackwood following a few paces behind, his gun still aimed at Will's back. Every step felt like a mile. He was walking into the lion's den with the lion right behind him, and he had no idea what he would find inside. He had just traded a lie for his life, and the bill was about to come due. The cave was dark and cool. As their eyes adjusted, they could see it, glimmering in the faint light, running in thick, unbelievable veins through the rock walls, was silver, pure, shining silver. Will's guess had been right. It was a king's ransom. Blackwood gasped, his eyes wide with an almost religious awe. He stepped forward, forgetting all about Will, and ran his hand along a thick vein of silver. He was mesmerized. He was lost. And in that moment of distraction, Will acted. He spun around, grabbing a loose rock from the cave floor, and brought it down hard on Blackwood's head. The cattle baron crumpled to the ground without a sound, his dream of riches ending in darkness. The immediate danger was over. But as Will stood there, breathing heavily in the silent, silver-lined cave, he realized a new, more terrible truth. He looked down at the unconscious man at his feet, and then he looked at the fortune glittering in the rock all around him. He had told the Apache that they cared only for their sacred land, not the rocks inside it. But now that he had seen this, truly seen it, could any man, red or white, be trusted to walk away from a treasure this vast? He had stopped a monster. But had he just unleashed a much bigger one? A curse of greed that could tear this whole territory apart. Will dragged the unconscious Blackwood out of the cave and into the sunlight. The Apache warriors descended from the ridge, their faces grim. They had seen the silver. Will could see the shock and awe in their eyes. The secret of the moon cave was a secret no more. Swift Creek Woman approached, her gaze fixed not on the silver, but on Will. "You risked your life for a lie," she said. "It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact." "I did what I had to do to save the boy," Will replied, "and to stop him." "You have done more than that," she said, her voice heavy. "You have shown us what is hidden in our sacred mountain. This knowledge is now a heavy stone. It can be used to build a new house, or it can be dropped and crush us all." She was right. The news of a silver strike this big would bring a flood of prospectors, soldiers, and killers. It would mean war. A war the Apache could not win. The very thing Will had tried to prevent, he may have just guaranteed. Running Fox came to his side. "You did not know," the boy said, as if reading Will's thoughts. "You acted with a true heart. That is what matters." But Will knew that good intentions weren't enough. Not in a world this hard. He looked at the bound and bleeding Margaret Sullivan, the unconscious Curtis Blackwood, the stunned Apache warriors, and the mountain full of silver. The situation was a powder keg, and he was standing right in the middle of it with a lit match. He had to make a choice that would decide the fate of everyone in the valley. "There's only one way," Will said, thinking aloud. "We have to hide it. We have to make it look like the silver isn't here." Swift Creek Woman looked at him, a flicker of interest in her ancient eyes. "How can one hide a mountain?" "We don't hide the mountain," Will said, his plan forming, wild and desperate. "We hide the entrance. We seal the cave, a rock slide, an explosion. We make it look like the cave-in happened a long time ago. We tell the world the vein was a myth, a rumor. It was an impossible idea. It would take an enormous effort, but it was the only idea he had." "And what of them?" Swift Creek woman asked, gesturing to Blackwood and Sullivan. Their tongues are not so easily sealed. A darker thought crossed Will's mind. The frontier had its own way of sealing tongues. Permanently. But he looked at Running Fox, who was watching him, his young face full of trust. And he remembered the boy's question. Can you put down their whips forever? That had to mean more than just violence. It had to mean finding a better way. No, Will said, shaking his head. We're not going to become them. We're going to give them a different kind of justice. He walked over to where Margaret Sullivan was tied up. Her shoulder was bandaged now, crudely, by one of the warriors. Her eyes were full of hate and fear. You have two choices, Margaret, Will said, his voice quiet. Choice one. We hand you and Blackwood over to the law in the next town. We tell them everything. The conspiracy, the attempted murder, the poisoned water, the silver. The whole territory will descend on this place, and there will be a war over that cave. You'll hang, but not before you watch your greed destroy everything. He paused, letting the words sink in. Or, he continued, there's choice two. You and Blackwood are going to help us. You're going to use your connections, your money, your influence to make this land a protected territory, an Apache reservation, deeded and sealed by the government, untouchable. You're going to spend the rest of your lives making sure this place and these people are safe. You will become their greatest protector. She stared at him, bewildered. That's insane. Why would I do that? Because, Will said, his voice turning to ice, the alternative is choice one. And because if you refuse, my justice will be quicker than any hangman's rope. You will help build a future here, or you will have no future at all. Your choice. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret looked from Will's unyielding face to the silent warriors surrounding her. She looked at the mountain that held a fortune she could never touch, and in her eyes something broke. The cold, calculating businesswoman was gone, replaced by a woman who had seen the abyss and was being offered one single, threadbare rope to pull herself out. And him? She whispered, nodding toward the still unconscious Blackwood. Oh, he'll agree, Will said grimly. He's going to spend his penance working with his hands. He's going to help these people redig the wells he poisoned. He's going to help them build the homes he tried to tear down. He's going to learn what it means to give back what he tried to steal. It was a form of justice the territory had never seen before. Not retribution, but restoration. Not a hanging, but a long, hard road to redemption. But as Will laid out this impossible, audacious plan, a new, chilling thought struck him. He was assuming he could control all the pieces. He had Blackwood. He had Margaret. He had the trust of the Apache. But there was one more piece to this puzzle. One more person involved in the conspiracy. The man who had sold Will the faulty information about the cattle tracks in the first place. The man who had confirmed Blackwood's story and sent Will down this path. The only other person in a position of power in Fort Buchanan. Sheriff Brody. And as if summoned by the thought, a rider appeared in the distance, coming fast. A lone figure with a glint of sun off a silver star on his chest. The sheriff. He was either coming to help, or he was coming to finish the job. And Will had a terrible feeling he knew which one it was. Sheriff Brody reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced calm that didn't fool Will for a second. He saw the captured Blackwood and Sullivan, the Apache warriors, and Will standing in the middle of it all. His hand never strayed far from his gun. Well now, Garrison, Brody said, his voice smooth as whiskey. Looks like you've been busy. Found yourself in a bit of a hornet's nest. Something like that, Sheriff, Will replied, his own body tense as a coiled spring. Turns out Blackwood's story about the stolen cattle was a lie. He was in a partnership with Margaret here. They were trying to run the Apache off this land to get at a silver deposit. Will was watching the sheriff's eyes. He saw no surprise, no shock, just a slight, almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth. Brody was in on it. He was the third partner, the one who provided the legal cover, the one who would have ruled Will's death a tragic accident. Is that so? Brody said, swinging down from his horse. Sounds like you've sorted it all out then. I'll just take these two into custody, and we can let the federal marshals handle the rest. It was a slick move. He was trying to regain control, to take the prisoners and the narrative away from Will. Once Blackwood and Margaret were in his custody, they'd never make it to trial. There'd be a prison break, or they'd be shot resisting arrest. He'd silence them, and the secret of the silver would be his alone. "I don't think so, Sheriff," Will said. "They're not going anywhere." Brody's friendly mask finally dropped. A cold, hard light entered his eyes. "Now listen here, Will. I am the law in this territory. You will stand down and let me do my job." "Your job was to uphold the law," Will shot back, "not to help these two poison wells and murder children for a piece of shiny rock." The accusation hung in the air. The Apache warriors tensed, their hands moving to their bows. Brody was outnumbered 20-1, but he didn't flinch. He just smiled, a cold, thin smile. "You're a fool, Garrison. You think you've won? You think you can change the way the world works with one good deed?" He shook his head. "Money is what makes the world work, and there's a mountain of it right behind you. You can't stand against that." "Watch me," Will said. And then Brody did something Will never expected. He didn't draw his gun on Will. He drew it and pointed it straight at Running Fox. "All of you drop your weapons." Brody screamed, his voice turning shrill. "Bows, guns, everything, or the boy dies first." The warriors froze. Swift Creek woman let out a small, strangled cry. Brody had found the one weakness in their wall of strength, the one person they would do anything to protect. Will felt a wave of cold fury wash over him. This man, this supposed keeper of the peace, was the worst of them all. He was hiding his rotten soul behind a silver star. "You don't want to do this, Brody," Will said, his voice dangerously low. "I'm the one giving the orders here." Brody shrieked, "Drop them, now!" And then something shifted in Running Fox. The boy who had faced down a whip and a rifle without flinching now stood with a pistol aimed at his head. But the look on his face wasn't fear. It was pity. He looked at Sheriff Brody with a profound and sorrowful wisdom. "My grandmother teaches," the boy said, his voice clear and calm, "that a man who must threaten a child to feel powerful is the weakest man of all." The words struck Brody like a slap. His face contorted in a spasm of rage. His finger tightened on the trigger. Will knew he had only a fraction of a second. He couldn't draw and fire in time. It was impossible. Brody was going to kill the boy. And in that impossible moment, Will did the only thing he could. He threw himself in front of Running Fox. A deafening blast echoed through the canyon. Will felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through his side. The force of it threw him to the ground. His vision swam. The last thing he saw before the world went dark was Swift Creek woman's face, her mouth open in a silent scream, and a dozen arrows flying through the air, streaking toward the man who had shot him. Justice had come to the canyon, but Will Garrison wouldn't be there to see it. Darkness. And then, pain. A dull, throbbing ache in his side. Will's eyes fluttered open. He wasn't in the dusty canyon. He was lying on a soft fur inside a lodge. The air smelled of wood smoke and strange, sweet herbs. A fire crackled nearby. Swift Creek woman was sitting beside him, grinding something in a stone bowl. She looked up and saw he was awake. A small, gentle smile touched her lips. "The bullet passed through," she said, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "The white man's lead is strong, but the earth's medicine is stronger. You will live." Will tried to sit up, a gasp of pain catching in his throat. "Brody?" he managed to ask. "He is gone," she said, and her voice held a finality that needed no further explanation. The arrows had found their mark. His star was empty, like his heart. Will lay back, the events of the canyon rushing back to him, the silver, the conspiracy, the impossible choice he had offered Margaret and Blackwood. He had been so close to forging a new kind of peace, and then it had all been shattered by a single gunshot. "What happened after?" he asked. "We brought you here," Swift Creek woman said. "We tended your wound, and we waited." "For what?" "For you to wake up. The future of this valley rests on a promise made between a rancher and an old Apache woman. I have kept my side. Now you must keep yours." Over the next few days, as Will slowly regained his strength under Swift Creek Woman's care, he learned what had happened. She and her warriors had taken Blackwood and Sullivan back to the now-abandoned Carmichael Ranch. They hadn't harmed them. They had simply waited. Waited to see if Will would live or die. If he had died, frontier justice would have been swift and bloody, but he had lived. And so the promise lived too. Running Fox was his constant companion, bringing him water and food, and telling him stories of his people. In the quiet of the lodge, Will learned more about the Apache way of life, their connection to the land, their deep spirituality, than he had in 20 years of living beside them. He saw the world through their eyes, and he was humbled. But it was on the fifth day that Swift Creek Woman told him the final secret, the one that would reframe everything he thought he knew. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her eyes searching his, "there is something you must understand about my grandson, the reason your kindness, your sacrifice, meant so much." Will waited, sensing this was important. "Running Fox," she said, her voice trembling with an old pain. "His father was not Apache. He was a white man, a soldier, a good man who fell in love with my daughter. He died years ago, defending our village from men like Blackwood." The revelation stunned Will into silence. Running Fox, the boy who was a living bridge between their two worlds. "The boy you saved," she continued, tears welling in her eyes, "he carries the blood of both your peoples. He has spent his life being called a savage by his father's people, and being looked at with suspicion by some of his mothers. He belongs to everyone and to no one." Will's own eyes grew misty. He finally understood. He understood the boy's impossible courage, his profound wisdom, and he understood the true meaning of his question. "Can you put down their whips forever?" He wasn't just asking for the Apache. He was asking for a world where a child like him could have a home, where he wouldn't be torn apart by the hatred between his two peoples. He was asking for a future. "When you threw yourself in front of that bullet," Swift Creek Woman said, her voice thick with emotion, "you were not just saving an Apache boy. You were saving her son. You were saving his son. You were answering his question with your own life." A tear rolled down Will's weathered cheek. He had come to the canyon to investigate a crime. He had found a conspiracy, a treasure, and a war. But in the end, he had found something more valuable than all the silver in the world. He had found a reason, a purpose. He knew what he had to do. The pain in his side was nothing compared to the fire in his soul. He was going to get up. He was going to leave this lodge, and he was going to build the future that Running Fox had asked for, even if it cost him everything. When Will Garrison, bandaged and leaning on a walking stick, rode back to the Carmichael Ranch, he found a strange and silent truce. The Apache warriors kept a stoic watch. Curtis Blackwood and Margaret Sullivan sat by a cold campfire, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. They looked like ghosts, haunted by the future they had almost created, and the one they were now being forced to build. Will gathered them together. There were no threats this time, no grand speeches, just the quiet authority of a man who had faced death and come back with a singular purpose. "The plan stands," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Sheriff Brody is dead. As far as the outside world is concerned, he was killed by Apache warriors while investigating the theft of Blackwood's cattle. A tragedy. But his death gives us an opportunity. It creates a power vacuum, a space for something new to grow." He looked at Margaret. "You will go back to Fort Buchanan. You will use your influence, your money, to petition for a new sheriff, a man we choose, a man who will honor the boundaries of the new territory. You will begin the legal work to deed this land to the Apache, citing it as a peace offering to prevent further bloodshed." Then he turned to Blackwood. "You will stay here. Your penance begins today. The first thing you will do is help my men create a rock slide to seal the entrance to the moon cave. You will bury your greed with your own two hands. Then you will begin the work of rebuilding what you tried to destroy." They didn't argue. They had seen what real power looked like, and it wasn't in the barrel of a gun. It was in the quiet resolve of a man willing to die for something he believed in. The weeks that followed were a blur of hard work and quiet change. Will, still recovering, directed the operation. His own ranch hands, loyal to a man, worked alongside the Apache warriors. They used dynamite from the trading post, supplied by a subdued Margaret Sullivan, to seal the cave. The mountain groaned, and a river of rock and dust poured down, bearing the secret of the silver forever under thousands of tons of stone. Curtis Blackwood worked harder than any of them. Silent, grim-faced, he hauled rocks, dug wells, and helped repair the Apache lodges. He was a broken man, but in the breaking, something new was being forged. Will would sometimes see him watching Running Fox, a look of profound shame and something akin to awe on his face. He was learning a new language, not of words, but of service and sweat. Margaret, true to her word, became a force of nature in the territorial capital. She spun a story of peace and reconciliation that was so compelling, so well-funded, that no one dared to question it. The death of a corrupt sheriff and the generous donation of contested land by a powerful cattle baron were hailed as a new model for frontier peace. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful, necessary lie. A lie built on a foundation of truth. Months passed, the seasons turned. A new sheriff, a good man handpicked by Will, now kept the peace in Fort Buchanan. The official deeds to the Apache territory, signed and sealed, were delivered by a humbled Margaret Sullivan. A school was built, where Apache children and the children of settlers could learn together. Swift Creek Woman taught her healing arts to the Newtown doctor, who in turn shared his medical knowledge with her. The whips were being put down, one by one. One evening, as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber, Will stood with Running Fox on a ridge overlooking the valley. They could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of the settlement and the cook fires of the Apache camp. The two lights, once symbols of division, now seemed to blend together in the twilight. "My grandmother says you have a new name among our people," Running Fox said quietly. "She calls you he who puts down whips." Will smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his steel-gray eyes. "I was just one man." "One man is all it takes to start," the boy replied, his wisdom shining. "You did not just put down their whips. You showed them how to build instead." Will looked out at the peaceful valley. It was not a perfect world. There were still old hatreds, old fears. But it was a start. It was a chance. It was the answer to a question a brave boy had asked in a dusty town square. He had thought saving Running Fox that day was the end of a story. He now knew it was the beginning of a much larger one. A story of how a cattle rancher, a broken cattle baron, a calculating businesswoman, and a wise Apache boy proved that even in the harshest of lands, the most valuable thing isn't buried in the ground. It's built, day by day, in the hearts of those brave enough to choose healing over hate and hope over fear. The story of Will Garrison and Running Fox became a legend in that part of the country. A quiet reminder that justice doesn't always come from a hangman's noose, and that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones we give away. If you enjoyed this story of courage and redemption, do me a favor. Hit that like button, and for more tales from the forgotten corners of history, make sure you subscribe. You never know what secrets the dust is hiding.